talking about some of the many problems with utilitarianism as a system of ethics. And we were talking about the conclusions that utilitarianism leads you to regarding having children. Mm-hmm. So if you're, for example, if you're trying to maximize the total sum of utilities in the world, that suggests that you should have as many children as you possibly can, assuming that your children will have greater than zero utility in their lives, which feels like a counterintuitive conclusion, would you say?
Absolutely.
Do neither of us have an answer to that? I don't, actually.
Well, it only happens if you try to maximize the sum of utility, but if you try to maximize the average, which is the other option, then you get into other problems. So I think anyway you cut it, it looks like we're dealing with some unsolvable conundrums.
So, taking the average version of utilitarianism then, even that, I think, has some problems if you're talking about the average utility. Well, I suppose there are two ways to look at it. You could be looking at maximizing the average utility of whoever exists, or you could be looking at maximizing the average utility of the people who exist.
Mm-hmm.
That sounded really similar. I just meant, in the latter version, you're only caring about the utility of actual people who already exist. Right? So then you wouldn't be worrying about having new children because they aren't, you aren't factoring into your calculations people who haven't been born yet.
Right. So this actually ties into environmentalism. Suppose that we end up completely messing up our planet for future generations, but in doing so, we make people today very happy. Because those people in future generations don't exist yet, should we value their utility? I think a lot of people's intuition is yes, that they should count. But the really bizarre things start happening when you consider the fact that our actions today might change who exists in the future.
Sure.
So for example, I mean, by using lots of oil today, clearly that has effects on all kinds of events that happen.
Sure.
Like,
it has effects on which jobs are available where, and that affects who lives where and who has which children, and even if you have two people who would meet each other and have babies in many of these possible alternative scenarios, they're going to meet each other and have babies at slightly different times, likely, in these different scenarios, and so they're going to have different children.
Right, the sperm that wins the race against the other sperm is going to be different.
Right, almost anything you do is going to have even slight ripple effects on other things going on in society, and that's going to, it doesn't take much, as we just said, to affect who gets born.
Right, so those future generations, although you may have reduced their utility compared to other future generations that will never have existed, or would have existed if you hadn't done all this oil-related exploitation, you still caused them to come into existence, so they can't be unhappy with your decision because they wouldn't have even existed in the first place had you not made that decision.
I'm reminded of an example, I think I read this in Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit, in which I think a politician in England a while back made some public comment about how women should not have children until they're old enough to fully support them, which sounds like a pretty uncontroversial statement, but a man wrote an angry letter to the editor of his paper saying, well, my mother had me when she was a young, unwed teenager, and she didn't really have the resources to support me, and yes, maybe my life could have been better, but what you're saying is that I should never have existed, that the world would be better off if I had never existed, and I'm offended by that. And I think this is a great sort of miniature example of the environmentalist problem, that he was not hurt. If anyone was hurt by her decision, it wasn't him. Sorry. The only person who could conceivably have been hurt by her decision to have a baby too early is the child. He's the child, and he's saying he doesn't feel hurt. So, yes, if she had waited, her child would have been better off in some sense, but it would have been a different person. There's no identifiable person we can point to that's being hurt by this decision.
But that person can't write from another dimension.
Right, from another possible alternative universe timeline.
Right.
It's really tricky.
Yeah, so actually another philosophical issue I want to talk about is the idea of, in utilitarianism, should we care about the happiness we deprive an individual of? Or should we only care about the actual utility experienced by existing beings? So this comes into play, for example, during abortion. Let's
Right.
suppose you're thinking of aborting a fetus.
Mhm.
Well, you could say, if that fetus is likely to have a happy life, you'll be depriving it of all the utility of its entire life.
Right.
Whereas if you killed an adult who had an equally likelihood of happy life, you'd only be depriving them of the remainder of their life. So
Right.
a 40-year-old adult, you might be depriving them at 50 years rather than their entire life. So by that argument, it actually would seem that killing a fetus is worse than killing an adult because there's more utility to deprive them of.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, that seems absurd. I mean, when I say absurd, I mean it runs counter to our intuitions.
Mhm.
But if you reject that, then there seems to be no way to explain why killing is wrong from a utilitarian standpoint. Once you are able to factor out potential influences like the effect the person's death would have on the loved ones who would suffer
And suffering they might experience while they're being killed.
Sure, exactly. So we were talking earlier about a hypothetical hermit who has no one who knows or cares that he exists, and you could theoretically kill the hermit painlessly. Almost every system of ethics would say it's just wrong to kill him, you're depriving him of his life. But if you are following a utilitarian system and you've already, as we just said, realized that you get these absurd conclusions when you worry about the disutility of depriving someone of life, then you're sort of left with no reason why it's wrong to kill the hermit, right? Assuming you could kill him painlessly.
Yeah, unless you
I don't have
perhaps...
any good argument for that.
I mean, yeah, no, it's certainly a tricky issue.
There's one other problem I can think of with utilitarianism, which is that in most moral systems, there are particular acts that are wrong, even when no one knows that they're being harmed. Let me clarify. So, for example, if someone asks for you to do something after they die, and you promise to do it for them, and then they die, in utilitarianism, you can't possibly harm the person by breaking their promise, because they've already lived their life. Their life is over. There's no way to make their life retroactively better or worse. But then you have no reason, according to utilitarianism, to keep your promise. Is there any way around that?
I mean, I think that we have to accept that utilitarianism leads to some very counterintuitive
Apparently
conclusions.
it does.
And, I mean, unfortunately, even really smart people in the utilitarian area who think about utilitarianism don't have really good solutions to these problems. Like, I've heard Peter Singer say that some of the issues around beings coming to existence and coming out of existence, he still doesn't feel like they're satisfactory answers for.
Yeah, he's kind of the champion of utilitarianism, as far as I know. I mean, in the deathbed promise case, you can come up with some examples of how having a general rule about honoring deathbed promises increases everyone's utility, because now living people's utility is increased knowing that their promises are going to be kept. But you can still come up with isolated thought experiment cases in which there would be no effects on other people's knowledge. So that's really tricky. And I have to say, just personally, when I run into these conflicts between utilitarianism and my intuitions, I go with my intuitions. And I can't come up with any argument for why my intuitions are better than utilitarianism. It's just that I was only following utilitarianism in the first place because it matched my intuitions. So when it doesn't, I don't follow it.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing that can get us around some of these issues is the fact that the real world is not like these hypothetical examples. You could never be sure that you could kill the hermit completely painlessly. You could never be totally sure that the hermit wouldn't have an impact on the world or isn't having an impact on the world.
Or that someone wouldn't find out.
Or someone would find out.
Make you more likely to kill other people.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in practice, these issues just don't really arise because of the uncertainties involved. So you have to avoid killing the hermit, even if you really believe in utilitarianism, because you just don't know the ramifications and it doesn't seem worth it.